The wind swept through the rows of headstones, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. It was one of those days when the world seemed to hold its breath, as if even nature understood the weight of sorrow that hung in the air. Richard Caldwell stood alone in the cemetery, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his expensive black coat. The fabric did little to shield him from the chill, but it wasn't the weather that made him shiver. It was the memories. 2 years had passed since the accident, though it felt like both a lifetime ago and just yesterday. Ethan, his only son, had been everything to him. A bright, curious boy with a knack for science and a heart full of kindness. Richard remembered the way Ethan used to run around their sprawling estate, laughing so loudly it echoed off the walls. Now, all that remained were photographs, mementos, and this silent grave. Richard sighed heavily and knelt down beside the headstone. His fingers traced the engraved letters, Ethan Caldwell, beloved son, as if touching them could bring some comfort. But there was none. Only emptiness. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push away the images that haunted him, the phone call, the hospital room, the lifeless body lying under white sheets. Opening his eyes again, he forced himself to focus on the present. This visit wasn't about reliving the past, it was about saying goodbye once more. Or at least, that's what he told himself every time he came here. As he stood up, brushing dirt off his knees, something caught his attention. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement near the grave. At first, he thought it might be an animal, a stray dog or perhaps a bird, but then he realized it was a person. A child. The boy couldn't have been older than 10. He sat cross-legged on the damp grass, close enough to the headstone that Richard wondered how long he'd been there without being noticed. His clothes were simple, jeans and a hoodie, but they looked like they hadn't been washed in days. His blonde hair was messy, sticking out in odd directions, and his sneakers were scuffed and muddy. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something striking about him. Maybe it was the intensity in his gaze or the calmness with which he sat as if he belonged there. "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice sharp despite his efforts to sound gentle. Strangers in places like this always made him uneasy. The boy didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Richard with wide, thoughtful eyes. "My name's Lucas," he said after a pause. His voice was soft but clear, carrying a hint of curiosity rather than fear. "What are you doing here, Lucas?" Lucas glanced at the headstone before answering. "I come here sometimes. It feels safe." "Safe?" Richard echoed, frowning. The idea of a child finding safety in a cemetery baffled him. "Why would you think this place is safe?" Lucas shrugged, his thin shoulders rising and falling beneath the oversized hoodie. "It just is. People don't bother me here." Richard stared at him, unsure of what to say. There was something unsettling about the boy's presence, yet also strangely magnetic. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Do your parents know you're here?" For the first time, Lucas hesitated. His gaze dropped to the ground and he picked at a blade of grass between his fingers. "I don't have any." "You mean?" Richard trailed off, unsure how to phrase the question delicately. "I don't remember them," Lucas clarified, still not looking up. "I've been on my own for a while now." Richard felt a pang of sympathy, though he tried to mask it. Life had taught him to be cautious, especially when it came to strangers. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that this boy was sitting by his son's grave speaking as if he knew something Richard didn't. "Why this grave specifically?" Richard asked, his tone sharper than intended. "Why Ethan's?" Lucas finally looked up, meeting Richard's eyes directly. For a brief moment, Richard thought he saw something flicker in those young eyes, something ancient and knowing. Then, it was gone, replaced by the innocence of a child. "It calls to me," Lucas said simply. "This spot. It's different from the others." Richard frowned, feeling a mix of irritation and unease. "Different how?" "I can't explain it," Lucas admitted. "But I feel connected to it, like it's waiting for something." The words sent a shiver down Richard's spine. He shook his head, dismissing the feeling as nonsense. Grief could make people imagine all sorts of things, and this boy was clearly no exception. Still, he couldn't bring himself to walk away just yet. "Listen," Richard said, pulling a business card from his wallet. He handed it to Lucas, who took it cautiously. "If you ever need help with anything, you can call me. Understand?" Lucas nodded, clutching the card in his small hand. "Okay." With that, Richard turned and walked back toward his car, leaving the boy behind. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, catching one last glimpse of Lucas sitting by the grave. Something about the image lingered in his mind long after he left the cemetery. That night, Richard sat in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey. The encounter with Lucas kept replaying in his mind, gnawing at him like an unsolved puzzle. What had the boy meant by connected? And why had he chosen Ethan's grave of all places? Sleep eluded him that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lucas's face, the calmness, the knowing look in his eyes. It was as if the boy carried secrets too heavy for someone his age. Secrets that somehow tied back to Ethan. By morning, Richard had convinced himself it was nothing more than coincidence. Kids wandered into cemeteries all the time, didn't they? They probably found them fascinating or spooky. There was no reason to read too much into it. But deep down, Richard knew he wouldn't forget Lucas anytime soon. It was a week later when Richard Caldwell found himself face to face with Lucas again. This time, however, it wasn't in the quiet solitude of the cemetery. It was at his own front door. Richard had just returned from a long day of meetings, his mind preoccupied with business matters. He hadn't thought about Lucas since their encounter at the graveyard, or so he told himself. But there the boy stood, clutching the business card Richard had given him like it was a lifeline. "Lucas?" Richard said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" The boy shifted nervously, glancing past Richard into the grand entrance hall of the mansion. "You said I could call if I needed help," he replied hesitantly. "But I didn't have a phone." Richard blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then he sighed, stepping aside to let the boy in. "Come on then, let's get you something warm to drink." As they walked through the house, Richard couldn't help but notice how out of place Lucas looked. His scuffed sneakers left faint marks on the polished marble floors, and his hoodie seemed even more faded under the bright chandeliers. Yet, despite his disheveled appearance, Lucas carried himself with a quiet confidence that made Richard curious. They settled in the study where Richard poured 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He handed one to Lucas, who accepted it gratefully, wrapping both hands around the mug to warm himself. For a while, neither of them spoke. Richard studied the boy over the rim of his cup, trying to decide what to say next. "So," Richard began finally, breaking the silence. "What brought you here, Lucas? Did something happen?" Lucas hesitated, staring into his mug as if searching for the right words. I've been thinking about what you said, about calling if I needed help, and..." He paused, looking up at Richard. "I think maybe I do need help, or at least someone to talk to." Richard leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "Talk to me about what?" For a moment, Lucas didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the window, where the late afternoon sun cast golden light across the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "About Ethan." The name hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He stiffened, gripping his mug tighter. "What about him?" Lucas met his gaze, unflinching. "He talks to me sometimes." Richard froze, unsure whether to laugh or demand an explanation. "Talks to you? How?" "I don't know how to explain it," Lucas admitted, frowning slightly. "It's not like hearing a voice out loud, it's more like feelings, memories, like he's showing me things." Richard stared at the boy, his skepticism warring with a flicker of hope. Could this really be happening? Was it possible that Ethan, his son, his boy, was somehow reaching out? Or was Lucas simply spinning tales to gain attention? "Show you what kind of things?" Richard asked cautiously. Lucas set his mug down and leaned forward, his expression serious. Things about him. Things only he would know. Richard's heart skipped a beat. Like what? The boy hesitated, then said quietly, like the time he built a robot in your garage when he was 8. You got mad because he used tools without asking, but then you ended up helping him finish it. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. That memory was private, a moment shared between him and Ethan, long before tragedy struck. No one else could possibly know about it. How do you know that? Richard demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Lucas shrugged, unfazed by Richard's reaction. Ethan showed me. He says he wants you to remember the good times. Richard sat back heavily in his chair, overwhelmed by a storm of emotions. Part of him wanted to dismiss Lucas's claims as nonsense, but another part, the part that missed Ethan desperately, clung to the possibility that this might be real. Could it be true? Could Ethan somehow still be connected to this world, communicating through this strange boy? What else has he told you? Richard asked, his voice quieter now. Lucas hesitated again, as if weighing his words carefully. He says he's sorry for leaving you and for not finishing something important. Finishing something? Richard echoed, confused. What does that mean? I don't know, Lucas admitted. He hasn't shown me that part yet. But whatever it is, it seems important. Richard rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of everything. If Lucas was telling the truth, and Richard couldn't rule it out entirely, then Ethan might have left behind some unfinished project, some piece of himself waiting to be discovered. The thought gnawed at him, filling him with both hope and dread. Stay here tonight, Richard said suddenly, surprising even himself. We'll figure this out together. Lucas blinked, clearly taken aback. You mean it? Yes, Richard replied firmly. If you're telling the truth, and I'm not saying I believe you yet, then we need to understand what's going on. And if you're lying... He trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken. Lucas nodded slowly, accepting the offer. Okay. Over the next few days, Richard grew increasingly convinced that Lucas wasn't making things up. The boy continued to share details about Ethan's life that no outsider could possibly know. Each revelation brought Richard closer to believing that Lucas truly had a connection to his son. At the same time, Richard began noticing changes in himself. The grief that had consumed him for 2 years started to ease, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever Ethan was trying to communicate, Richard was determined to uncover it. To assist in the investigation, Richard hired a team of private investigators to look into Lucas's background. They scoured databases, interviewed people, and followed leads, but nothing turned up. It was as if Lucas had appeared out of thin air with no record of his existence before meeting Richard. Meanwhile, Richard allowed Lucas to stay at the mansion indefinitely. The boy adapted quickly to the luxurious surroundings, though he remained humble and respectful. He spent hours exploring the library, poring over books on science and technology. Richard often found him curled up in a chair, reading intently. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Richard decided to broach a sensitive topic. Lucas, he began, choosing his words carefully. Do you ever remember anything? About your parents? Before you came to the cemetery? Lucas shook his head, his expression thoughtful. Not really. Sometimes I dream about them, but it's always blurry, like they're far away. And you don't know why you can hear Ethan? No, Lucas admitted. But I think it's because I'm supposed to help you. Richard frowned, unsure how to respond. The idea that a child could hold such responsibility was unsettling, yet Lucas seemed completely at peace with it. There was a maturity in his demeanor that belied his age, as if he'd lived far longer than his 10 years. As weeks turned into months, Richard's bond with Lucas deepened. Though he still struggled to fully comprehend the boy's abilities, he trusted him implicitly. Together they embarked on a journey to unravel the mystery of Ethan's unfinished work, a journey that would lead them to places beyond imagination. But for now, in the warmth of the mansion surrounded by books and memories, Richard allowed himself a rare moment of peace. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone. It started with a dream, or at least that's what Lucas called it. One night, Richard was awakened by the sound of footsteps echoing through the mansion. At first, he thought it might be one of the staff, or perhaps an intruder. But when he followed the noise to the attic, he found Lucas standing in the dim light of a single bulb, surrounded by piles of dusty boxes. "What are you doing up here?" Richard asked, his voice low but firm. Lucas turned to him, his eyes wide with excitement. "Ethan led me here," he said simply. "He wants us to find something." Richard frowned, crossing his arms. "Find what?" "I don't know yet," Lucas admitted, "but I think it's important." Despite his skepticism, Richard couldn't ignore the urgency in the boy's voice. Together they began rummaging through the cluttered space, opening boxes and sifting through decades' worth of forgotten belongings. It wasn't long before Lucas let out a triumphant cry. "Here," he exclaimed, pulling out an old, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. Richard recognized it immediately. It belonged to Ethan. Taking the journal from Lucas, Richard flipped it open. The first page was filled with Ethan's familiar handwriting, detailed notes, diagrams, and equations that made little sense to Richard, but clearly showed his son's brilliance. As he skimmed further, he realized this wasn't just any project. It was something far bigger and far stranger than anything Ethan had ever attempted. This is incredible," Richard murmured, his voice tinged with both pride and confusion. What exactly was he working on? Lucas leaned closer, studying the sketches of intricate machines and cryptic symbols. "Something about dimensions," he said slowly. He wanted to talk to people in other worlds. Richard's brow furrowed. "Other worlds? You mean like parallel universes?" Lucas nodded. "That's what Ethan kept showing me. He believed there were other versions of himself, other versions of everyone, living in different places. And he thought he could build something to reach them." The idea seemed impossible, even laughable. Yet as Richard continued reading, he couldn't deny the depth of Ethan's research. His son had been meticulous, documenting every step of his process. There were references to quantum physics, electromagnetic fields, and even ancient texts about interdimensional travel. It was as if Ethan had combined science and mysticism into one grand experiment. He must have been working on this for years, Richard said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Maybe he was afraid you wouldn't understand," Lucas suggested softly. "Or maybe he didn't want you to worry." Richard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Whatever the reason, it was clear, now that Ethan's death hadn't been just a tragic accident, it had interrupted something monumental, something unfinished. "We need to finish it," Richard declared suddenly, surprising even himself. "If this is what Ethan wanted, then we owe it to him." Lucas looked at him, his expression serious. "Are you sure? This isn't going to be easy. Some of these things, they might not be safe." Richard hesitated, considering the risks. But the thought of leaving Ethan's work incomplete felt worse than any danger they might face. "We'll take it slow," he said finally, "one step at a time." Over the next few weeks, Richard and Lucas threw themselves into reconstructing Ethan's invention. They converted one of the mansion's spare rooms into a makeshift lab, filling it with tools, wires, and pieces of equipment ordered online. Using the journal as their guide, they painstakingly assembled the device Ethan had described, a metallic sphere covered in glowing blue panels, powered by an array of batteries and circuits. As they worked, strange things began happening around the house. Lights flickered without explanation, objects moved on their own, and faint whispers echoed through empty hallways. At first, Richard dismissed these occurrences as coincidences or tricks of the mind, but Lucas insisted otherwise. "It's Ethan," he said one evening, watching as a pencil rolled across the table by itself. "He's trying to help." Richard wanted to argue, to rationalize everything away, but deep down, he believed Lucas. The presence they felt wasn't malevolent, it was guiding them, urging them forward. Finally, after months of effort, the machine was complete. It stood in the center of the lab, humming softly with energy. Richard and Lucas stared at it, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. "Are you ready for this?" Richard asked, glancing at Lucas. Lucas swallowed hard but nodded. Let's do it. With trembling hands, Richard activated the device. The blue panels lit up brighter, casting an eerie glow across the room. A low hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. Then, without warning, a shimmering portal appeared in front of them, a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Through the portal, Richard saw glimpses of another world. It was beautiful and surreal, with landscapes unlike anything he'd ever imagined. Rolling hills of crystal stretched toward a sky filled with 3 suns, and strange creatures moved gracefully in the distance. But what truly caught his attention was the figure stepping out of the portal. It was Ethan. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. His son looked older, taller, and somehow different. His eyes glowed faintly, and his body seemed to shimmer, as if caught between 2 realities. Yet despite these changes, it was undeniably Ethan. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice echoing strangely. "You shouldn't have done this." Richard stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Ethan, my boy, I've missed you so much." Ethan smiled sadly, shaking his head. "I'm not the same person anymore. After the accident, I crossed over. I merged with something else. Part of me is still human, but part of me belongs to another world now." "What does that mean?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. "Can you come back? Can you stay?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at Lucas. "It's complicated. Crossing dimensions isn't meant to be easy or safe. Every time I try to return, it strains the fabric of reality. If I stay too long, it could tear apart both worlds." Richard refused to accept this. "There has to be a way. We can fix it, Ethan. We can bring you home." "No," Ethan said firmly. "You don't understand. This machine, it's dangerous. You're playing with forces you can't control." Before Richard could respond, the portal began to destabilize. The room shook violently and sparks flew from the machine. Panic surged through Richard as he lunged toward Ethan, desperate to pull him fully into their world. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, pushing Richard back. "You're making it worse." But Richard wouldn't listen. Blinded by grief and determination, he reached for his son one last time. In that instant, the machine overloaded, sending a surge of energy coursing through the room. When the chaos subsided, the portal was gone, and so was Ethan. Richard collapsed to his knees, overcome with grief and guilt. He had failed again. Beside him, Lucas lay unconscious, having shielded Richard from the worst of the explosion. As the dust settled, Richard realized the cost of his actions. The machine was destroyed, and Ethan was lost once more. But Lucas's sacrifice reminded him of the responsibility he now carried, not just to his son, but to the boy who had risked everything to help him. In the days that followed, Richard vowed to honor both Ethan and Lucas by using what they had learned wisely. Though the journey had ended in tragedy, it had also opened his eyes to the mysteries of the universe and the power of love that transcended even death. The air crackled with electricity as the portal grew wider, revealing glimpses of another dimension. Rolling hills of crystal sparkled under 3 blazing suns, while strange creatures moved gracefully across the alien landscape. But Richard Caldwell barely noticed any of it. His eyes were fixed on the figure stepping through the swirling vortex. Ethan. His son looked different now, older, wiser, and yet not entirely human. His body shimmered faintly, as if caught between 2 worlds, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. Despite these changes, there was no mistaking him. It was Ethan. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice echoing strangely, neither fully present nor distant. "You shouldn't have done this." Tears streamed down Richard's face as he took a step. "Frico, Ethan, my boy, I've missed you so much." Ethan smiled sadly, shaking his head. "I'm not the same person anymore. After the accident, I crossed over into another realm. I merged with something else. Part of me is still human, but part of me belongs somewhere else now." Richard's heart ached at the words. He couldn't accept that his son was gone, or, worse, trapped between dimensions. "There has to be a way," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We can bring you back, we can fix this." "No," Ethan replied firmly. "You don't understand. Crossing dimensions isn't meant to be easy or safe. Every time I try to return, it strains the fabric of reality. If I stay too long, it could tear apart both worlds." But Richard wasn't listening. All he could think about was holding his son again, having him home where he belonged. Blinded by grief and desperation, he lunged toward Ethan, reaching out to pull him fully into their world. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, pushing Richard back. "You're making it worse." The portal began to destabilize, rippling violently as the machine overloaded. Sparks flew from the panels and the room shook with increasing intensity. Lucas, who had been standing silently beside Richard, suddenly threw himself in front of the billionaire, shielding him from the worst of the chaos. An ear-splitting crack filled the room as the machine erupted in a burst of energy. The portal collapsed, vanishing along with Ethan. The lights flickered, plunging the lab into darkness before emergency lighting kicked in, casting a dim red glow over the wreckage. When the dust settled, Richard found himself on his knees, trembling, with shock and despair. The machine was destroyed, reduced to a pile of smoking debris, and Ethan, his son, was gone once more. Beside him, Lucas lay unconscious, breathing shallowly. Richard crawled over to the boy, cradling him gently. Guilt washed over him like a tidal wave. Lucas had risked everything to protect him, and Richard didn't even know if the boy would survive. "Lucas," Richard whispered hoarsely, brushing hair away from the boy's pale face. "Please wake up." For several agonizing minutes, all Richard could do was sit there, holding Lucas and staring at the ruins of the device that had promised so much and delivered only pain. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. He had let his grief cloud his judgment, and now he might lose the second person who had tried to help him reconnect with Ethan. Finally, Lucas stirred, groaning softly. As he opened his eyes, "Mr. Caldwell," he murmured weakly. Relief flooded through Richard. "You're okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank God you're okay." Lucas winced as he sat up, rubbing his head. "What happened?" "The machine overloaded," Richard explained grimly. "It's gone. Everything we worked on. It's destroyed." Lucas glanced around the lab, taking in the charred remains of their invention. Then he looked at Richard, his expression somber. "And Ethan?" Richard shook his head, unable to speak. Tears welled up in his eyes again, but this time they weren't just for Ethan. They were for Lucas, for himself, and for the reckless hope that had driven them to this point. "I'm sorry," Lucas said quietly. "I tried to warn you. Some things aren't meant to be changed." Richard sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. "I should have listened. I thought I could bring him back, no matter the cost. But all I did was hurt everyone, including you." Lucas gave him a small, sad smile. "You were just trying to make things right. That's not a bad thing. But sometimes we have to let go, even when it hurts." The words struck a chord deep within Richard. For 2 years he'd clung to the memory of Ethan, refusing to accept that his son was truly gone. Now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he realized how selfish he'd been. He had dragged Lucas into this mess, risking the boy's life for a dream that was never meant to come true. Over the next few days, Richard devoted himself to caring for Lucas, ensuring the boy recovered from his injuries. Though physically unharmed, Lucas seemed quieter than usual, as if the events in the lab had left an invisible mark on him. As they cleaned up the remnants of the project, Richard found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The journal, the machine, the portal, all of it had been a testament to Ethan's brilliance and curiosity. But it had also been a reminder of the boundaries humans weren't meant to cross. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Richard decided to share his thoughts with Lucas. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly. Maybe this wasn't just about bringing Ethan back. Maybe it was about understanding him, truly understanding what he cared about. Lucas nodded slowly. Ethan wanted to explore the unknown, to push limits and discover new possibilities. That's why he built the machine. Yes, Richard agreed. And maybe the best way to honor him is to keep exploring, not recklessly like I did, but carefully, thoughtfully. Lucas looked at him, his eyes shining with approval. That sounds like something Ethan would say. Richard managed a small smile. He always was smarter than me. In the weeks that followed, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He sold his company, donating a significant portion of the proceeds to scientific research and charities supporting children like Lucas, kids who had nowhere else to turn. With the rest of the money, he established a foundation dedicated to advancing groundbreaking technologies, inspired by Ethan's vision. Though he never forgot the tragedy that had unfolded in the lab, Richard came to see it as a turning point. Moment when he stopped running from his grief and started using it to make a difference. And though he missed Ethan every day, he found solace in knowing that his son's legacy lived on, not just in memories, but in the countless lives touched by his work. As for Lucas, he remained a constant presence in Richard's life. The bond they had formed during their journey together was unbreakable, forged in moments of danger and discovery. Together they vowed to carry Ethan's spirit forward, honoring his dreams without repeating his mistakes. Even so, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't quite over. There were still mysteries waiting to be unraveled, secrets hidden just beyond the edge of understanding. Somewhere, somehow, Ethan was still out there, and Richard knew, deep down, that their paths would cross again. But until then, he would focus on the here and now, on healing, helping others, and keeping alive the spark of curiosity that had defined Ethan's short but extraordinary life. Months passed since the catastrophic events in the lab, and life began to take on a quieter rhythm for Richard Caldwell. He had sold his company, established the foundation, and dedicated himself to helping others, a decision that brought him unexpected fulfillment. Yet, despite the progress he'd made, there was still an emptiness inside him, a lingering ache that no amount of work or charity could fill. On a crisp autumn morning, Richard returned to the cemetery where it all began. It had become something of a ritual for him, visiting Ethan's grave whenever the weight of his grief felt too heavy to bear. This time, however, he didn't go alone. Lucas accompanied him, walking silently by his side as they approached the familiar headstone. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. Richard knelt down beside the grave, tracing the engraved letters with his fingers. "Hey, buddy," he murmured softly. "I miss you." Lucas stood a few steps back, giving Richard space but staying close enough to offer support if needed. After a while, Richard rose to his feet and turned to the boy. "Thank you for coming with me today," he said, his voice warm with gratitude. "It means a lot." Lucas nodded, offering a small smile. "I wanted to be here. For both of you." They lingered for a moment longer before starting the walk back to the car. As they moved through the rows of headstones, Richard noticed fresh footprints in the damp grass. Footprints that hadn't been there when they arrived. They led away from Ethan's grave, disappearing into the distance. "Do you see that?" Richard asked, pointing to the tracks. Lucas followed his gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, someone else must have been here." But Richard wasn't so sure. Something about the footprints felt familiar, like a whisper from the past calling out to him. He shook off the feeling, chalking it up to his overactive imagination, and climbed into the car. Later that evening, Richard sat in his study, staring out the window as twilight settled over the mansion. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. He sipped a glass of whiskey, lost in thought, when a soft knock interrupted his solitude. "Come in," he called, expecting Lucas. Instead, he was surprised to find the boy standing in the doorway, holding a folded piece of paper. "This fell out of one of the books in the library," Lucas explained, handing it to Richard. "I think it might belong to Ethan." Richard unfolded, the paper carefully, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized his son's handwriting. It was a note, hastily scrawled but full of meaning. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But don't worry, I'm okay. There's so much more to the universe than we can imagine, and I've only scratched the surface. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop believing in the impossible. Love you always, Ethan." Tears welled up in Richard's eyes as he read the words over and over again. It was as if Ethan were speaking directly to him, reminding him of the lessons he'd tried to teach during his short life. "He knew," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "He knew what would happen." Lucas nodded solemnly. "Maybe he did. Maybe that's why he left clues for us, to help us understand." Richard folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. "You know, Lucas, I used to think my purpose was to bring Ethan back. But now I realize it's bigger than that. It's about honoring who he was and who he wanted to be." Lucas smiled, his youthful face lighting up with hope. "That sounds like something worth fighting for." In the weeks that followed, Richard threw himself into the Foundation's work with renewed energy. He funded groundbreaking research projects, supported young inventors, and even started hosting annual science fairs in Ethan's name. Each event drew crowds of curious minds eager to learn and innovate, just like Ethan had been. Through it all, Lucas remained by his side, growing into a bright and confident young man. Together they became a team, working tirelessly to push the boundaries of human knowledge while remaining grounded in the values Ethan had embodied: curiosity, compassion, and courage. One day, as they strolled through the bustling halls of a science fair, Richard paused to watch a group of children demonstrating a prototype robot. Their laughter reminded him of Ethan, of the countless hours his son had spent tinkering in the garage. He smiled wistfully, feeling a pang of nostalgia, but also pride. "You okay?" Lucas asked, noticing Richard's expression. "I'm good," Richard replied, nodding toward the kids. "Just thinking about how far we've come. How much Ethan would have loved this." Lucas grinned. "He'd probably be building robots, twice as fast as these guys." Richard chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Oh, without a doubt." As the day came to an end, Richard and Lucas drove back to the mansion in comfortable silence. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the countryside. When they arrived, Richard noticed something unusual: a figure standing near the front gate. At first glance, it looked like a child, a boy with messy blonde hair wearing clothes that seemed slightly too big for him. Richard frowned, unsure whether he was seeing things. Then the boy turned and began walking down the driveway, disappearing into the twilight. "Did you see that?" Richard asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Lucas squinted into the fading light. "See what?" "That boy. It looked like... well, it looked like you." Lucas raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Probably just someone passing by." Don't read too much into it, but Richard couldn't shake the image from his mind. It was as if fate, or perhaps Ethan, had given him one final glimpse of the mysterious boy who had changed his life forever. That night, Richard lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts drifted between memories of Ethan, reflections on the journey he'd shared with Lucas, and the strange encounter at the gate. Though he couldn't explain it, he felt a sense of peace settling over him, a quiet assurance that everything had happened for a reason. The next morning, Richard visited the cemetery once more. This time he went alone. As he stood by Ethan's grave, he felt a gentle breeze brush against his cheek, carrying with it the faintest whisper of laughter. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. When he opened them again, he noticed something resting on the headstone, a single white feather. Picking it up, Richard smiled, knowing exactly what it meant. Ethan was still watching over him, and Lucas, wherever he was safe. With a deep breath, Richard tucked the feather into his pocket and walked away, ready to face whatever the future held.